What happens when a world leader is mistaken for an ordinary passenger? When appearances deceive, and true character is quietly revealed 35,000 feet above the ground. This is the powerful, true story of a flight attendant, a misjudged man, in economy class, and a silent lesson in humility that took the entire plane by surprise. On a flight from Paris to Burkina Faso, a seasoned airline crew made a decision they would never forget. A man dressed simply was asked to give up his seat in first class for a loud, demanding executive. He didn't protest. He didn't reveal his status, because he didn't need to. What followed is a rare moment of truth, character, and redemption, something the world could use more of. Stay until the end, because what this man finally said will touch your heart, and might just change the way you see people forever. If you're new here, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who still believes in the quiet strength of kindness. It was just another ordinary flight, or so it seemed. Flight AF 723, bound from Paris to Ouagadougou, was almost fully booked. Passengers bustled through the aisles, adjusting luggage, tapping away at tablets, and sipping espresso as soft announcements filled the cabin. But amid the routine and the noise, something extraordinary was about to unfold. And no one, not even the crew, saw it coming. Sophie Lemaire, a flight attendant with 15 years under her belt, moved gracefully through the cabin. Elegant, poised, professional, she had handled turbulence, medical emergencies, even celebrity meltdowns. But today her challenge was diplomacy of a different kind. First class was overcrowded. A high-profile executive had missed his connection. The airline needed to squeeze him into a seat that simply didn't exist. The solution? Ask someone, anyone, to move to business class. Sophie scanned the cabin with trained eyes, seeking someone who might accept the request quietly. And then she saw him, a black man seated alone, dressed modestly in a beige shirt and dark pants. He wore simple glasses, reading a book on African economics with serene focus. No flashy watch, no designer briefcase. Compared to the Armani suits and Mont Blanc pens around him, he appeared unremarkable. A decision was made in an instant. Sophie approached him with a polite but firm tone, explaining the situation. A VP needed his seat. Would he mind relocating? Compensation would be offered, of course. The man looked up slowly. His gaze was calm, measured. "Is there a problem with me being here?" he asked softly, his French perfect, but laced with a subtle Borinab accent. Sophie blinked just slightly. A few passengers nearby turned their heads. What happened next would not only reshape her understanding of respect and status, it would become a story she would never forget, and neither will you. The question hung in the air, simple, direct, yet impossible to answer without revealing something deeper. "Is there a problem with me being here?" Sophie hesitated. Her training kicked in, professionalism first. "No, sir, it's just, we have a priority passenger, Mr. Deere, Vice President of Globex Industries. The airline has asked if someone would be willing to give up their seat in first class." He didn't flinch. He didn't argue. Instead, he studied her for a moment, then nodded with quiet dignity. He closed his book slowly, marked his page, and slipped it into a worn leather bag. His movements were calm, almost ceremonial. "I understand," he said gently. "I will move." Sophie was almost stunned. She had braced for resistance. She thought she might have to negotiate, persuade, maybe even call a supervisor, but none of that was needed. The man simply stood, gathered his things, and followed her into business class. As they walked down the aisle, Sophie double-checked the passenger list. "Mr. Traoré," she read silently. She led him to a window seat and offered a small, relieved smile. "Here's your new seat. I'll bring your compensation paperwork shortly." He paused, then responded with a voice so calm it almost disarmed her. "That's not necessary, but I would appreciate a cup of tea after takeoff." Simple, polite. No hint of offense, frustration, or entitlement. Back in first class, Sophie seated the executive, Mr. Deere, who immediately began grumbling about the delay. His presence shifted the mood, loud, impatient, and entirely unaware of the quiet man he had displaced. The plane lifted into the sky. Passengers settled into their routines. To most, it was just another flight. But to one woman, and eventually, to many others, it was the beginning of a lesson in humility that would ripple far beyond the clouds. 2 hours into the flight, calm had returned. Sophie had slipped back into routine, refilling drinks, handing out meals, checking on first-class passengers. The man in business class hadn't spoken again, just sipped his tea, read his book, and kept to himself. He was easy to forget, or so she thought. That changed in a heartbeat. Amina, the youngest flight attendant on the crew, leaned in beside her during meal service. Her voice dropped to a whisper, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Sophie, do you know who that man is? The one you moved?" Sophie blinked. "Traoré? Why?" Amina glanced around, then said it. "That's Ibrahim Traoré, the president of Burkina Faso." For a second, Sophie couldn't process the words. It sounded like a joke. "No way, the president? Are you sure?" I double-checked. "He sometimes travels under low profile, especially for private diplomatic trips. The captain just got word from air traffic control in Ouagadougou. There's a delegation waiting for him on the tarmac." Sophie felt her chest tighten. Her face burned. She turned slowly to look toward business class. There he was, still reading, still calm, still there. She had made him move. She had taken the leader of a nation and traded his seat for a corporate executive who was now snoring into a champagne glass in first class. Her hands trembled. Her thoughts blurred. "He said nothing," Sophie whispered, as if trying to justify it. "He didn't mention who he was, not a word." Amina nodded. "That's who he is, humble, reserved. A lot of people admire him for that." Sophie didn't say anything more. She couldn't, because in that moment every polite smile, every instinctive decision, every assumption she had made suddenly felt impossibly shallow. She hadn't just moved a man. She had misjudged greatness. Sophie couldn't shake the feeling. Shame clung to her like turbulence clings to the wing of a plane, persistent, rattling, and impossible to ignore. She busied herself with serving drinks, resetting trays, and adjusting blankets. But every time she passed through business class, her eyes were drawn to him. Mr. Traoré, no, President Traoré, still seated calmly, still lost in his book, still dignified. How could he be so composed? How could someone so important be treated so casually and accept it without a flicker of pride? In the galley, Sophie leaned against the wall, trying to steady her breath. Amina stood beside her, listening quietly as Sophie whispered her regret. "I asked him to move because he didn't look the part. That's the truth," she confessed, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engines. "He looked ordinary." Amina nodded, her tone gentle. "We all make those judgments. It's human. What matters is what we learn from them." Sophie sighed, the guilt growing heavier with every passing mile. "I need to apologize," she said, her throat tight. "I have to." But Amina placed a hand on her arm. "Not now. The captain said his visit is classified. No announcement. No attention. We have to stay discreet." Sophie nodded reluctantly. Still, the storm inside her was louder than any captain's order. She had failed to recognize quiet power, the kind that doesn't demand attention or seats or titles, the kind that sits peacefully, without indignation, even when wronged. And maybe that was the point. Maybe that was what true power looked like. She looked down the aisle once more, where President Traoré gently sipped tea and stared out the window, at clouds bathed in gold, a leader in economy class, a lesson in humility and still waiting to be learned. As the flight crossed into West African airspace, a light tremor ran through the aircraft. Slight turbulence, but enough to jolt Sophie back into the present. She steadied herself, walking down the aisle once more. But this time, she wasn't just checking on passengers. She had something to say. There he was, President Ibrahim Traoré, still composed, still reading, still radiating the kind of quiet confidence that needed no announcement. Sophie paused at his row, Her palms were clammy, her heart racing. She cleared her throat gently. "Excuse me, sir, may I offer you anything?" He looked up and smiled warmly. "No, thank you. Everything is perfect." She hesitated. The words she rehearsed felt suddenly inadequate. I want to apologize for earlier," she said, her voice quiet. "It wasn't right what I did." He studied her, not with judgment, but with a kind of patience that only true leaders possess. "You were doing your job, miss. You don't need to apologize." "No," she insisted, her eyes lowering. "I made an assumption. I judged you by how you looked. And I'm deeply sorry." He closed his book and set it on his tray table. Then he looked at her, as if weighing her soul, not her words. "Do you know why I didn't say anything?" he asked gently. She shook her head. "Because none of that matters. Not the seat, the title, or the class. What matters is how we treat people and whether we remain true to our values." His words struck like lightning, but without pain, just clarity. "I've learned," he continued, "that real leadership doesn't need to shine. It doesn't need first class. It needs integrity, humility, and grace." Sophie felt a lump rise in her throat. For the first time in her long career, she didn't know how to respond. "Come, sit for a moment," he said, motioning to the empty seat beside him. She hesitated, then sat. At 35,000 feet above the earth, Sophie wasn't just flying, she was falling. Out of assumptions into awareness. For a brief moment, the hum of the engines faded. The chatter in the cabin disappeared, and it felt like the sky itself was listening. Sophie sat beside President Ibrahim Traoré, unsure where to look. At his eyes, which held neither pride nor resentment, or at the window, where the sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky in streaks of orange and lavender. "I don't know what to say," she admitted quietly. He smiled gently. "Who I am doesn't matter," he said, voice low but resolute. "What matters is that we are all human beings deserving of the same dignity, regardless of titles, uniforms, or the price of our seats." Sophie's chest tightened. She'd spent years in the air, learning every safety protocol, memorizing every beverage request, and mastering the rhythm of service. But she had never been trained for this. A lesson in humanity delivered mid-flight. "You could have stayed in first class," she said softly. "You had every right," he shrugged. "And what would that have changed? Who I am is not defined by where I sit. If anything, the view is better here." Sophie followed his gaze. Outside, the clouds drifted like mountains in motion, illuminated by a golden light that seemed too beautiful to belong to this world. "I will never forget this," she whispered. "Not just about the sky, but about him, his words, his grace." He turned back to her, nodding once. "We all learn, Miss Lemaire, every day, even presidents." The seatbelt sign lit up overhead. Sophie rose, instinctively smoothing her skirt, but something inside her had shifted. Quietly, powerfully. She wasn't just returning to work. She was returning with eyes that saw differently, a heart that judged less, and a soul forever marked by a stranger's wisdom, above the clouds. As the flight neared its destination, the mood aboard subtly shifted. A whisper here, a raised eyebrow there. Word had begun to circulate quietly among the crew and a few perceptive passengers that someone important was on board. Sophie, now, back in the galley, wiped her hands slowly on a napkin. Her mind replayed the conversation with President Traoré like a film on loop. She had apologized, but it still didn't feel like enough. She had taken something from him, not just a seat, but a moment of dignity. And though he had forgiven her with astonishing grace, she still carried the weight of that moment. Then clarity. She walked to the front of the aircraft, where Mr. Deere, the same executive who had been so eager to reclaim his lost seat, was now finishing a glass of brandy. Sophie approached him with a calm confidence she hadn't felt earlier. "Mr. Deere," she began, her voice steady, "we have a very important guest in business class. I'd like to ask if you would consider switching seats with him for the remainder of the flight." He raised an eyebrow, clearly annoyed. "Important guest?" "Yes, sir. The president of Burkina Faso." Mr. Ibrahim Traoré. There was a beat of stunned silence. Then, in a flurry of motion, Mr. Deer was on his feet. Of course, I had no idea. Please, yes, I'll move immediately. Sophie couldn't help but notice the irony. The same man who had unknowingly displaced a head of state was now eager to correct his position. Once status had a name. She walked back down the aisle, heart racing but full. As she neared the president, he looked up from his window, the faint outline of Burkina Faso visible in the distance. Mr. President, she said gently, we'd be honored if you'd return to your rightful seat in first class for the landing. He looked at her for a long moment, then smiled. So, you found out who I am. President Traoré looked up at Sophie, his eyes reflecting more warmth than surprise. So, you found out who I am, he said with a small, amused smile. Sophie nodded, her voice soft but sincere. Yes, Mr. President, and I'm very sorry. He gently raised a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. I told you already it didn't matter. She paused. It matters to me, she said, her voice firmer now. Not for your title, not for protocol, but for the respect you deserve. He looked at her thoughtful. Then, after a beat, he stood. Very well, he said, but only because it matters to you. As he walked through the cabin, returning to the seat that had once been his, Sophie noticed something extraordinary. The atmosphere changed. Even passengers who didn't know his identity seemed to sense this quiet presence, this unspoken authority wrapped not in arrogance but humility. Conversations hushed. Eyes followed him with curiosity and something else, respect. Before the landing, Sophie returned to him one last time. Mr. President, she said, standing beside him, this flight, this moment, it changed how I see people, how I see myself. He turned toward her, kindness in every line of his face. We are all both teachers and students in this life, Miss Lemaire, he said. What matters is keeping our hearts and minds open to the lessons. Outside, the lights of Ouagadougou twinkled like fallen stars across the earth. My country, he continued, glancing out the window, is not rich in material things, but we are rich in spirit and in dignity. I hope one day you will come and see that for yourself. I would love to, Sophie replied, voice trembling with emotion. When the plane touched down and the doors opened, a small, respectful delegation waited. No red carpet, no fanfare, just quiet, dignified welcome. Later that night in her hotel room, Sophie wrote in her journal, Today I embarrassed a president and learned what true greatness looks like. And from that moment forward, she never looked at a uniform, a title, or a seat number the same way again. Some stories don't end with applause or headlines. Some end with a handwritten note, a warm cup of tea, and a lesson whispered into the heart. President Ibrahim Traoré never demanded a seat. He never raised his voice. But in his silence, he taught everyone on that plane, and now maybe everyone watching, what true leadership looks like. It isn't in titles or first-class tickets. It's in grace, in restraint, in the power to forgive. Even when no one is asking for it. Sophie Lemaire will never forget that flight, not because of turbulence or passenger complaints, but because one man reminded her, and all of us, that greatness doesn't shout. It listens. So the next time you're tempted to judge someone by their clothes, their seat, or the silence they carry, remember, the most powerful person in the room might be the one quietly sipping tea in row 14B. If this story moved you, drop a comment below. Share it with someone who needs a little faith in humanity today. And always remember, respect costs nothing but means everything.